Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be continuing our fantasy football 2024 preseason coverage, doing our positional breakdowns with the wide receiver buy list for the 2024 season. You know, a lot of fantasy analysts, they have their like, dislike, or love, hate. Well, you know, we got to make it money themed here at Mike's Money Picks. So we do the buy and the sell list. So this is the wide receiver buy list. So these are the wide receivers who I have ranked higher than consensus at their position. These are the wide receivers that I am willing to draft ahead of their current ADP, and they all have pathways, and I think they will outpace their current ADP and outperform that current ADP. Essentially, I want to leave drafts with these wide receivers on my roster one way or another. Now, I'm only going to talk about 5 receivers that are on the buy list today. There's a lot more that I could go into. So if you want my full ranks as well as all the best ball tools that we have for this season, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. If you are watching on YouTube, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of our positional breakdowns. The wide receiver sell list will be coming out later tonight, as well as the tight end list that's going to come out tomorrow. And you can scroll back on the channel and on the audio feed to find the quarterback and running back episodes we've already released earlier this week. So yeah, that's going to go ahead and do it for the introduction. Let's go ahead and start talking about some wide receivers. We're going to dive in with the first wide receiver that I am buying for the 2024 season. This is a third-year breakout candidate at the wide receiver. Well, I am wondering if anybody was able to guess it based off of that hint. There has been a long list in the last decade of wide receivers who have broken out in fantasy in their third season in the NFL, and I believe that Garrett Wilson is going to be the next one on that list. Now, I only have him ranked slightly ahead of ADP, but it's enough because he goes so early in the drafts that it could greatly have an impact on how you draft the rest of your roster, as well as if you're playing best ball, affect your entire portfolio if you're routinely taking Garrett Wilson ahead of some of the other guys that I have him ranked ahead of. So Garrett Wilson, his current ADP is 12, and that ranks as the 7th wide receiver off the board. I have him ranked as my 6th wide receiver off the board at number 9 overall. Now, the case for Garrett Wilson is not a case that is backed up by anything that has happened statistically in terms of his performances in the first 2 seasons. He finished his first 2 seasons in the NFL as wide receiver 32 and wide receiver 30 in fantasy points per game. However, here's the good news. The wide receiver position, to me, is the opposite of the running back position. Wide receivers have to earn targets. You have to go out and you have to get open and you have to catch the football, right? So if a wide receiver can earn targets, that means that they're going to be able to put up fantasy points because they're going to get the ball thrown their way, right? Now, from there, all these other mitigating factors determine how much of those targets turn into fantasy points. Was it an accurate throw? Was it a deep target or a shallow target? Is it in the red zone? You know, is it on an offense that is running a lot of plays and scoring a lot of points and producing more volume, right? So to me, Garrett Wilson had all of those factors playing against him in each of his first 2 seasons in the NFL. He earned over 140 targets in both his rookie season and his sophomore season last year. It just didn't amount to much because his quarterbacks were always missing him, or they weren't having a lot of success. They weren't moving the ball down the field. They weren't scoring touchdowns. So to me, with Aaron Rodgers being in New York this year, that signals a clear turnaround, and it should allow Garrett Wilson to really finally reach his fantasy ceiling. Do not discount the fact that he hasn't been like a world beater in fantasy his first 2 years in the NFL. This is the time for Garrett Wilson to hit his 3rd-year breakout. If you think that I'm full of crap here and think that, well, you know, what if it's just same old, and it happens again? Well, there is a rating called expected fantasy points per game. It basically takes into account the volume of targets and the position, or like the depth of target, in terms of you know, how accurate quarterbacks should be and how many touchdowns a guy should score, and you know, kind of just puts everything on a bell curve, right? And Garrett Wilson, in the rating expected fantasy points per game, ranked as wide receiver 6 last season. So in other words, if all other factors were equal, quarterback play, success of the offense, volume, all that, a guy who earned targets as often and where Garrett Wilson did should have finished as wide receiver 6 in fantasy scoring. I think Aaron Rodgers being a quarterback this year can help him realize that. And also the long historical trend of wide receivers hitting their breakout in their 3rd year also backs it up as well. So I think Garrett Wilson is a big-time breakout candidate this season. I have him as my wide receiver 6, my number 9 overall pick. If you are sitting at the end of the 1st round, I do not think that is a very enviable spot in drafts this season, but if Garrett Wilson falls to you, you can take him with confidence and feel pretty good about what you get, and really have a lot of flexibility for what you do with your next pick at the start of the second. The second receiver on my buy list is going to be Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. His current ADP is 53. He ranks as the 26th wide receiver taken off the board. I have him 5 spots ahead of that. He is my wide receiver 21. And so I got to be honest, I don't really know why people are expecting Amari Cooper to regress big time this season. He has finished as wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game in back-to-back seasons in Cleveland. Now, Cleveland has, kind of had a rotating carousel of quarterbacks each of the last 2 seasons. They've had the ghost of Deshaun Watson in 2022, along with some other guys. Last season, it was Watson, and then it was like DTR and PJ Walker, and then it was Joe Flacco to end the season. And he still managed to come in as wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game, no matter who was throwing him the ball in both of his seasons in Cleveland. That to me is impressive. And I don't see a reason to expect any kind of regression from him. He is still an elite target earner. And really, if you're just saying, oh, well, he had Joe Flacco throwing to him, that's the reason why he did so good last season. Well, then how does that explain that he was wide receiver 17 in 2022 as well? And then, this year, I don't think that there's going to be any downside to going back to Deshaun Watson as opposed to having Joe Flacco throw him the football. So I just think that people are looking to downgrade Amari Cooper when nothing statistically evidences that he should be downgraded. Last season, he ranked 7th in the league in air yards. So not only was Amari Cooper being targeted a lot, he had a significantly high target share, but being 7th in the league in air yards means that he was getting targeted deep down the field, and he was getting them thrown his way a lot. And so I really think that Amari Cooper is going to be able to continue what he's done in Cleveland. He is my wide receiver 21 off the board. One thing I will warn you of, though, you can go look at it historically. The time he was in Dallas, the time he was in Cleveland, Amari Cooper, big home road splits. Significantly better player at home than on the road. For whatever reason, maybe he just loves his own bed. Maybe he just loves his routine. I don't know. But Amari Cooper, significantly better player at home than on the road. Keep that in mind when you have him on your roster and you're sitting, staring at a Week 14 road game with the fantasy playoffs on the line, or a home game with the fantasy playoffs on the line. Amari Cooper, his home road splits. There's enough of a sample size there to say that there is something, and you especially need to have him in your starting lineup when Amari Cooper is at home. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick breather after those first 2. We got 3 more to get to here on. Now, before I continue, I do want to mention that all of these rankings are for season-long fantasy leagues that are redraft, not dynasty, not superflex, anything like that. And, they're for redraft. I don't think they're specifically for best ball personally, but if you want to use the player takes in best ball and say I'm going to bump up Garrett Wilson a few spots, or I'm going to bump up Amari Cooper a few spots, that I think is a very valid thing to do. Now, number 3. On my list, we're going to talk about a guy that had a down year in 2023, had a great year, breakout year in 2022, and now I think he's in a much more comparable situation this year to what he was in 2022 as opposed to 2023, and that is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Christian Kirk's current ADP is 69. He comes off the board as the 31st wide receiver. I have him ranked as my 27th wide receiver off the board. Now, we mentioned Christian Kirk's story here. Well, back in 2022, he was the prime target for Trevor Lawrence. He finished the season as wide receiver 18 in fantasy points per game. And last season, he finished as wide receiver 33 in fantasy points per game. And it's very easy to see a reason for the regression. Christian Kirk saw a regression in every single stat except for yards per reception and average depth of target in 2023. So here's what that means. Christian Kirk was seeing the same type of targets in 2023 that he saw in 2022. He just wasn't seeing as many of them. And why was that? Well, the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2022, after the 2022 season, let me phrase it correctly. After the 2022 season, they went out and added Calvin Ridley to their roster. And Calvin Ridley does a lot of the same things that Christian Kirk does. Both are better as off-the-ball wide receivers. Both are better in the slot. And so having 2 guys that kind of tried to occupy one role, it just really wasn't a great fit offensively. And, somebody had to lose out on volume, and it was Christian Kirk last year, going all the way down to wide receiver 33 in fantasy points per game. But Calvin Ridley is no longer a Jacksonville Jaguar. The 2 receivers that Jacksonville added in the offseason, they drafted Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU. They signed Gabe Davis in free agency. Those are 2 guys who are outside wide receivers, physical, on the ball, gonna beat press, gonna make big plays, down the field wide receivers. Christian Kirk can go back to the role he was in 2022, where he lines up in the slot, off the football, getting all of the little underneath and crossing targets that he is so good at. And he's going to go back to getting all of those, not sharing them with Calvin Ridley. And so I have Christian Kirk as my wide receiver 27. I think he is in great position to return to the form that he had in 2022, where he was wide receiver 18 when he was exclusively in that slot role. Now, the fourth wide receiver that is on my buy list. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of hints. This is a rookie, and he is my favorite rookie personally. And I think he is the rookie with the highest ceiling in fantasy football over the course of his career, not opposed to this season. It's Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. So let's dive in. Now, am I a little bit biased because I'm a Texas fan and Xavier Worthy is a Longhorn? Maybe, but I don't care. I love Xavier Worthy this season. I love the outlook for his entire career. I think that you talk about very rarely in the NFL do we look before the draft and say, this guy is a perfect fit for this system, and if he goes here, the rest of the league is in trouble. I kind of said the same thing about Kyle Hamilton when he was drafted, out of Notre Dame, going to the Ravens. I'm like, that guy's a perfect fit for what they do. He's going to be great, very clearly. And I was kind of right on that one. I can't victory lap all of them because nobody goes 100% in their predictions. But to me, that was exactly what I thought about Xavier Worthy and the Kansas City Chiefs. This is the perfect player for what the Chiefs like to do. This is the perfect system for Xavier Worthy to be in. So Xavier Worthy's current ADP is 82. He comes off the board as the 37th wide receiver. I have him ranked as the 33rd wide receiver. He is my highest ranked Kansas City wide receiver. He comes off the board as the third Kansas City wide receiver currently. So let's break down Xavier Worthy and why I think this is such a perfect fit. Well, Xavier Worthy had a college career that very few guys can match. He had 100 targets in each of his 3 college seasons. Now, we could also dive deeper into the weeds and say that there is a lot of value in a receiver who was an early declare and went after their junior year. Those guys tend to have more NFL success than guys who wait until after their senior year or after their COVID senior year. But I digress. Xavier Worthy was at Texas for 3 seasons. He had 100 targets in each of them. He led his team in receiving yards his freshman season. He was a true freshman stepping onto the campus of the University of Texas, weighing 160 pounds, and he led the team in receiving yards. That's impressive. It is. Like you're talking about a Power 4 team, and he led them in receiving yards as an 18-year-old freshman. It doesn't happen very often. Marvin Harrison Jr., as great of a wide receiver prospect as he was, as a true freshman, was sitting behind Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith-Njigba, but could not see the field at Ohio State. Xavier Worthy was leading Texas as a receiver. Now, Xavier Worthy also showed up to the combine, ran the fastest 40-yard dash in league history. That also is not just like track speed or just for show. That speed shows up on film. He's an electric return man, and he made a lot of deep plays at Texas. He was used on jet sweeps and screens where you could see the acceleration and the burst and the speed once he got to the open field. Go turn on the tape of the 2021 Red River Shootout. You can watch Xavier Worthy take a bubble screen 80 yards to the house on the first play of the game, and you see the speed in the open field. When he was at Texas, the 10-yard curl route to Xavier Worthy was open all the time because defensive backs played so far off of him that he could just come out like a sprint off the line, make them think he was running a go, turn around at 10 yards, and Quinn Ewers was able to rifle it to him. That was one of their best, like, second and long, third and medium type of plays because you have to respect Xavier Worthy's speed. Now, here's why this matters, and here's why Kansas City was a perfect fit. Kansas City, for the first 4 years of Patrick Mahomes' career, had one of the fastest wide receivers in league history, the little guy by the name of Tyreek Hill. And what was Tyreek Hill's one unique characteristic? He was really, really fast. And what did the Chiefs do with Tyreek Hill? They utilized him in ways where they could get him the ball on jet sweeps, on screens, on flat routes, on RPOs, bubbles, as well as just targeting him deep down the field on crosses, posts, goes, whatever. They found ways to utilize his speed and get the most out of Tyreek Hill. They can do the same with Xavier Worthy, and Xavier Worthy's faster than Tyreek Hill according to 40-yard dash time. Now, here's why a lot of people are wanting you to temper expectations on Xavier Worthy. The Kansas City Chiefs don't really ever go full blow with like a rookie skill player. Isaiah Pacheco was kind of eased into the system 2 years ago. Rashee Rice was kind of eased in last year. Didn't have a high snap share at the start of the season, was still effective when he was in. But at the end of the season, when you saw the snap share rise up is when you really saw Rashee Rice take up. Tyreek Hill, his rookie season, finished the year as wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game, but he was not a full-time player until the second half of the season. So there's two observations with that. One, he was a full-time player for half a season. He was still wide receiver 32 in his rookie season. Xavier Worthy, I have him as my wide receiver 33. So really, if he just has Tyreek Hill's rookie season, you're going to be okay with where you draft him. The second part of that, though, is Xavier Worthy is kind of going to be needed to be on the field. Here's why. You remember the Chiefs wide receivers last year? Well, yes, they had Rashee Rice, who was great at the end of the season. He could be getting suspended. You remember Marquez Valdez-Scantling? He's gone. Justin Watson, Kadarius Toney, they're still there, but they're not great. No offense to those guys. They're not great NFL wide receivers. And then Marquise Brown, the guy that really kind of plummeted Xavier Worthy's stock was Marquise Brown coming over to the Kansas City Chiefs because everybody's like, oh, Marquise Brown, he can be in the Tyreek Hill role. He's really fast. He was really good in Baltimore. He was really good in Arizona. Go look at the underlying metrics. He has a lot of drops. He does not get the most out of his targets. Xavier Worthy has in college. And by the way, Marquise Brown is injured. So Xavier Worthy is going to be on the field as a full-time player. We expect at least that to happen. And he's going to be, we hope, in the Tyreek Hill role faster than Tyreek Hill. So the ceiling of Xavier Worthy is prime Tyreek Hill. I cannot stress that enough. And the floor is Marquez Valdez-Scantling last year, except Xavier Worthy, much better player, in my opinion, than Marquez Valdez-Scantling. I think this is the perfect landing spot for the perfect type of player that the team needed. I just think this is a great spot. Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 33, and I think I might be even drafting him a little bit higher than that personally at this point. Now, the last wide receiver on my buy list is going to be Jakobi Meyers of the Las Vegas Raiders. So this is one of the most puzzling rankings to me ever. So Jakobi Meyers last year was wide receiver 24 in fantasy points per game. He was second on his team with a 21% target share. Yes, Devontae Adams is there, but what you have to realize is that because they were on the field essentially all the time, those two guys, Adams and Meyers, accounted for over 50% of their team's targets. That doesn't happen very often at all. Meyers was 21% of those targets. That's nothing to sneeze at. That's a pretty high percentage. That's higher than a lot of guys that are being drafted as wide receiver 1s and 2s. Jakobi Meyers right now is being drafted with an ADP of 135, ranked as the 53rd wide receiver off the board. I have him as my 48th wide receiver off the board. I think Jakobi Meyers has a significantly higher floor than a lot of the other guys around him because I think it's very likely that he is going to again see a 20% plus target share this year. And, maybe it's not going to be the best offense. Gardner Minshew, I think, is an improvement over Aiden O'Connell. If I'm being honest, Gardner Minshew is going to throw the ball down the field. He made Michael Pittman Jr. fantasy viable last season for the Indianapolis Colts. So I think that this is a pretty good spot for Jakobi Meyers to maybe not fully repeat what he did last season, but he can at least be a guy that you draft and can be a spot starter in the flex if somebody's on a bye or somebody gets injured, and you can feel confident that he's going to have a role in the offense and that he is going to get some targets thrown his way and he's going to score some fancy points. And you can't say that about a lot of the other guys that he is being drafted around. And so that is why Jakobi Meyers is my wide receiver 48 off the board. I didn't go totally all in and put him as like wide receiver 30 or anything like that because I do think his ceiling is quite limited because of the offense he plays in and the competition for targets that he faces. But if he just does what he did last year, he will very easily outpace where he is being drafted, and he will quite easily be a guy who could fill in and give you just a high floor and some quick fantasy points when you need. All right, so that is going to do it for this episode, guys. Those are the 5 wide receivers that are on my buy list for the 2024 season. If this episode helped you in any way, helped you prepare for your draft, helped give you some names that you might not have thought of, please hit the like button on YouTube. Please rate and review if you're listening on audio. It really helps me out a ton whenever you guys do that, and I really do appreciate it. And while you're there, go ahead and subscribe. That way you can be with us for the rest of our positional previews, as well as our weekly content through all the fall for all of our golf, college football, and NFL content that is going to be coming your way weekly. Now, also, if we talked about best ball just a little bit, right? If you want to give best ball a shot, it's 2 weeks before the season starts right now. Great time to start drafting. Head on over to Underdog, use my promo code from my personal account, mconnolly88, and you will get your first deposit matched up to $100. So basically, it's free money. So if you're sitting there like, maybe I want to try best ball, I'm going to do $25 worth of drafts. Use my code, and now you can do $50 worth of drafts. No catch. Just put in the code mconnolly88. Link is in the description if you need that. And lastly, if you want to see my full rankings, you want to know all about all the wide receivers that I like and don't like, and I could go on and on about some of these wide receivers, but I only want to do 5 for the show. Head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike'sMoneyPicks. You get access to all of my ranks and all of the tools for best ball. All right, but that is going to do it for this episode, guys. Hopefully I was able to give you guys some good information, give you guys plenty of names to look out for as you start your fantasy drafts this season. Best of luck to you guys in your fantasy leagues this year. Hopefully I was able to give you guys something that is going to help you out. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you guys